Women and their bodies should not be seen as commodities to be bought and sold.
Varje fredag natt så finns vi ute på Malmskillnadsgatan, som då är känd som en prostitutionsgata. Vi är ett team på 4-5 personer som alltid går ut. Jag har handplockat 38 stycken. Och det vi gör då, det är att koka kaffe, nyponsoppa och O'boy från om någon håller på att drunknar. Och det gör vi inte heller på Malmskillnadsgatan. Vi lämnar inte gatan om det är fullt strid eller det är någonting som har hänt och så. Så måste vi finnas tillgängliga, måste vi finnas hos flickorna. Jag själv har ju levt ett mycket ruskigt liv. Jag har haft en förfärlig barndom. Och jag blev våldtagen eller utsatt för sex när jag är 5 år. Och sedan så fortsatte det undan för undan. När jag är 16 år, då säljs jag utav en kvinna som jag blev kär i. Hon blev min låtsasmamma. Det var bara det att hon säljer mig till prostitution. Jag tror fullt ut 100% på den svenska lagen som kom. Och jag högaktar att Sveriges riksdag har tagit beslutet 99 att det är förbjudet att köpa sex. Men det är tillåtet att sälja sig.
But Elisa Lindqvist's story did not end in humiliation and darkness. Her life took a whole new turn, and she has now dedicated her remaining years to protect and secure women from all form of commercial sexual exploitation, enabling them to enjoy their fundamental rights and freedoms.
There we go. So it was a short clip about Elise, and this clip is much longer if you go in. It's 9 minutes if you go in and look online. But Elise's story is significant in the sense that she's one of the many who experienced violence in the home, who experienced abuse as a child, and to then later become a victim for human trafficking. And so we think that it's really important to look at the links between these different crimes, because they're all linked together, and we have to have legal structures that combat them and that work well in that sense. And so what happened in Sweden was that this conversation led to a great solution. Before, in the sex industry, what had happened was that oftentimes if you wanted to reduce the sex industry and make it smaller, you would criminalize the women who actually were selling sex. And so that was the most known model at that time. But what people were saying now in this new conversation was that no, but actually, prostitution is the reality of prostitution is it's vulnerable people. It's people that have been experiencing domestic violence in their childhood. It's people that need protection and need help and need exit programs, like what Rebecca Tolstoy and the Path of Hope Foundation are providing. And so the perspective changed from looking at these women as the criminals or the people in prostitution as the criminals to actually saying, no, actually, it's never been about this has never been a human rights issue, the right to sell yourself. Now, the true face of prostitution and the sex industry is that it's vulnerable people, women and children that are being exploited. And so that shifted the perspective. And in this work that the Swedish government did leading up to these laws, some of the things, the research that they did, they came to these findings that prostitution poses serious damage to both individuals and the society as a whole. The buying and selling of sex is closely connected to organized crime such as drug trafficking, sex trafficking, pimping, assault, etc. The majority of prostitutes are women, and they are often subjected to various crimes such as rape and theft. And the fact that men can buy access to women's bodies is contrary to the perception of equal value of all people and the pursuit of equality between women and men. The sex trade was said to convey an acceptable view of human beings, and the cost of injuries caused by the sex industry and prostitution and the crimes involved in it were also considered to be negative effects on the society. And it was stated that relatives and children often suffer massively in the background, directly or indirectly, from the injuries that are caused by the sex industry. Organized prostitution is also virtually invariably followed by increased criminality, such as, for instance, financial crimes, drug offences, sex trafficking, and violence. And so these were some of the findings that the Swedish government brought forth. And they said that because Sweden wanted to move toward a culture that respected women and a culture that was communicating that violence against women is not okay, they also said that we have to look at the sex industry in the same context, because we can't try and stop domestic violence and violence against women and disrespect against women, and then on the other side of that legalize or just let the sex industry grow, because when it grows it brings with it trafficking, and it's going to lure in young people that are in vulnerable situations as well. And so Sweden decided to then try and minimize the sex industry as much as possible. And so the perspective shifted, and they said, we're going to protect the people, so we want to reduce demand as much as we ever can, because it makes sense that if we have less demand, then we will have less problems, less trafficking. And so what Sweden did is they turned it and they said it's going to be illegal to buy. We're going to go for the demand rather than the people that are selling. And then we're going to say it's actually not illegal to sell. We want to communicate a message to the women in prostitution that we are on their side, and that we are here to help them, and that there are exit programs, and that society is there for them, and that the police and social workers are people they can trust and call and rely on. And so this legislation became part of a government bill on violence against women, and it included domestic violence, sexual harassment in the workplace, and prostitution. And then it became really successful. And so now, actually, I'm just mentioning this here, that now the European Union has actually recommended all its member states to follow this and introduce these laws as well. But many other countries have. So Norway followed soon after, Ireland, sorry, I just have my list here, Canada, Israel, France, and a few other countries have also changed their laws. And so this has been, if you look at around the world, countries that have changed their legislations, this has been where most of them have moved towards. And so that is really encouraging. And then if we look at this picture here, this is one of the things that I think is so great with this legislation. And so this guy here that you can see, his name is Simon Hagstrom, and he's a little bit of a famous guy in Sweden. He's the head of the Stockholm trafficking unit. And so he works with meeting these women and going out together with social workers. They screen the internet with the main focus is to look for human trafficking and to look for underage kids, and to try and then meet with these people and explain their rights, explain that we're on your side, we have exit programs when you need to leave, if you need to leave. If they suspect human trafficking, they can do razzias and they can rescue girls. And they also criminalize. They also catch guys who come to buy people for sex. And so this has sent a strong, clear message to the general public in Sweden that buying someone for sex, treating another human being as a commodity, is not okay. And over time, over these 20 years, this message has really changed the way Swedes and people in Sweden think about prostitution. Today, prostitution and trafficking are very, very closely linked in people's minds. And so this police unit, the way they work, they really emphasize good exit strategies. And this is where the work that Rebecca and Path of Hope is doing is so very important. Because if we don't have good exit strategy programs for people that are experiencing domestic violence and that are experiencing, being in the sex industry, being trafficked or whatever, being lured into the industry, being abused, then we can't help them. And so that's one of the key things, is the work that the Path of Hope Foundation and Rotary is obviously, a very, very important partner together with Salvation Army in making that a reality. So just thank you for that. It's such an important job. So good exit strategies is a key thing. And then what they talk about as well is the importance of training police and social workers, because these girls, the people in the sex industry, they're not shackled by chains of metal like we think, over here, slavery, but they're there by force and coercion, and they're often held by fear. And so there's no way for a buyer to actually know whether a girl that is seeing is trafficked or not. She's not going to be, looking like she's bruised and abused and hurt, because she would never be able to get away with that. And so these girls they cover up what's actually going on, and they're living in fear. And so the police and the social workers need to know how to help them. They need to have special training. And just an example is that in Sweden, some of the trafficking that's been occurring, there has been girls from Nigeria that has been brought into Sweden under horrible circumstances. And these girls are being held by voodoo. So traditional beliefs and religions from their home country is what the traffickers have been using, and they force them to enter these blood covenants with the traffickers, where they believe with all of their being that if they leave, that themselves and their family will be cursed. And so that takes quite a bit of training and understanding for the police and the social workers to be able to speak about that and explain that that's not the truth, and that it's a strategy for the traffickers to hold the girl. And there's been some really great stories of girls that do listen and that do come with the police and social workers to the many exit strategy programs that we have in Sweden. And then, this another important thing is the education about the true face of the sex industry, because the sex industry is making so much money. It loves to glorify the pimps and the brothels, and the people that are on the money-making side of the sex industry loves to glorify it and make it sound like it's just a job like any other, and it's it's something that you can do, and then you can just do whatever else you want to do. And I'm going to show you some statistics on how not true that is in just a little bit. But education is very key in this. And so Simon and his friends and his colleagues, they work a lot with this. And so he's actually written 4 books. One is called Shadow Law, the true story of a Swedish detective fighting human trafficking. And so that's all going to be in my notes if you're interested in reading that. So it's novels based on the girls' stories that he has met. But I'm actually going to read just a short story here for you from his social media account. And so this is a true story of a girl that he's met in a conversation that he's had with her. How is it possible that hundreds of men in a civilized society stand in line for the opportunity to rape a young girl who has just entered puberty? After a 17-hour-long work session, it is the questions that keep spinning in my head. When you get to sit down in peace and talk to a girl who has been through events that we as adults can't even imagine a child ever having to suffer through, it is difficult even for a tough human trafficking cop to not hold back tears. There are many of them, very many, the girl notes gloomingly as she sits opposite me and hugs her pillow. Among all the stories of abuse, one worse than the other, it is difficult to find words. What should I say to someone who has repeatedly been betrayed by the adult world that for a child should be a symbol of security and trust? The answer is simple. Even though one is tempted to lose faith in humanity, the message in such a situation is straightforward. No matter how dark your past has been, there's always a way out on the other side. You have your whole life ahead of you, and you can realize your dreams. And it is never your fault. The reaction does not wait. Tears, anger, sorrow. A few hours later, we part ways. We each receive a warm hug and a heartfelt thank you for the coming and putting an end to all the darkness. Before we go, the girl tells us that she dreams of becoming a lawyer. I answer her that I hope that one day she becomes a prosecutor so that she can bring the pimps and the pigs who abuse young girls and boys into prison. She smiles and says that she will think about it. Sometimes I get extra touched by the people I get the benefit of meeting in my work. And so it's such a touching story, and when I read it, I was crying a little bit as well. But he does this. Simon shares these stories on social media constantly, and over the years, his work has changed the culture in Sweden, and it's changed the way that the general public sees sex work and prostitution. And so I just want to, I think it's so important with these kind of heroes to point out that there are people like Simon, who's out there fighting, working for the best of all these girls and women and young boys and whoever he finds, to speak to. And also, people like you, Rebecca, with Path of Hope Foundation, and just not getting tired of your work. And also, I actually was going to acknowledge as well, we have Dave McCleary here today, which I'm so thankful and excited that he's here. And he's the Rotary International Global Chair for Anti-Trafficking. I actually got the opportunity of meeting Dave and Rebecca last year, and it was just a great conversation that we had. And I appreciate all the work that is being done around the world to reduce human trafficking. And the work that Rotary is doing is absolutely key in this, because you guys are everywhere, and so if we can do that, if anyone can do this, you can. And so I'm just really, really thankful and excited to get to do this with Rotary. And so I'm going to take you on to just look at a little bit of statistics of some of the people that are in the sex industry, what they say. And so there's been some studies done, and then out of 827 prostitutes in 9 different countries, 70 to 95% expressed that they had experienced physical assault. And that we have to mention expressed, because not everyone is willing to actually speak or able to actually speak about their experiences. And the truth is, my experience from meeting people that are coming out of the sex industry, and I met a few very, very brave girls that I've been speaking to, but they suffer from post-traumatic stress syndrome on a very high levels. And for them to even come out and be able to share their stories and their hurt often takes many, many years and a lot of courage. And so these girls experience horrible things as they are in the sex industry. And then we have a percentage here, 68% of those girls in that same study had a lifetime diagnosis of post-traumatic stress syndrome, which is obviously terrible. How can we say that an industry like that is just a job like any other? If we know that this is what happens to the girls, this is what happens to whoever enters into this industry, it is not a job like any other. It is something we need to protect our children from, our daughters from, our sisters from, our young boys from, and we need to build a culture that minimizes the sex industry, not that makes it bigger. Another thing that I think stood out was that 95% of those asked this is a different study, it's a London University report, 95% to 98 expressed that they wanted to leave the industry. And this is a quote in accordance with what Simon, the police officer, says as well. He says that he very, very seldom meets someone who actually wants to be in the industry. They're there because of threats, they're there because they're feeling that there's absolutely no other option for them. There's nothing else they can do to survive or to take care of their children, whatever their story is, but that is not their choice to do that. The European Parliament has stated that some member states estimate that between 60 and 90% of those in their respective national prostitution market has been trafficked. And so we have to talk about trafficking and human trafficking as well when we're talking about the sex industry, because that is, it's a perfect place for organized crime to make money. And so if you think about it, if you organize crime and you're going to make, you have lots of money and you want to make it clean, well, then a brothel is the perfect place to do money laundering, because people always pay cash, and so no one really knows how much money you can make through a brothel. And so it's an easy way to laundry money, and it's also a very lucrative business because you can sell a person over and over and over again. Some of these girls see 30 men in one shift, and so they work so hard, and and so if we just have to look at, we have to look at the sex industry and realize that that is the reality of what is going on underneath the surface. And these countries that the EU Parliament is referring to is actually the Netherlands and Germany. And I'm going to show you why just now. And so we have been talking about prostitution and the sex industry a little bit. And as I said, Sweden went, in 1999, Sweden introduced these laws, and they were really successful. And so straight away, the prostitution market was reduced to 50%, just a few months after. But then as time went, one of the biggest factors was that the industry just didn't grow. It stayed very much the same as it was before those laws were introduced. It wasn't eradicated completely. There were still people in prostitution. So in 2014, there was a big inquiry done in Sweden about the effects of the legislation. And then they said that there was about 7,000 ads on the internet in Sweden for sexual services, and the police and social workers, they estimated that would have been between 2,000 and 3,000 people, because every person in prostitution and trafficking, there's many different ads for each person. So that was 2014, and so the industry had stayed very much the same as it was when, or even a little bit lower than what it was when those laws were introduced. But then we have to look at what happened to the countries around Sweden. And so, I mean, some could say that it wasn't a success then if the industry didn't get smaller. But what happened around Sweden was that the sex industry grew massively in the other countries, and it did not do that in Sweden. So if we look at Germany, who has 7 times bigger population than Sweden, in that same year, 2014, they legalized 1 year after Sweden criminalized, and so they went the other way, you could say. And just have to explain first what legalizing means. And so to legalize prostitution it usually comes from a good perspective, that we want to make the industry safer. We want to create rules and structures around the industry so that the girls are protected. Maybe, you have an age, you can't be under 21 and work, and you have to have social insurance and things like that. And so there's a good thought behind it, but the reality is that we see in country after country that legalizing prostitution it does not work that way. When we legalize prostitution, we send a message to the community, to the culture, that it is okay. We're sending the message that it's okay to buy someone for sex. And so what happens is the industry starts growing and becomes bigger, because the demand side grows, and organized crime will always supply that demand. And so in Germany, just in 2014, there was 400,000 people in prostitution in Germany. Compare that to Sweden's 2,000. And then you had 1 million clients per day. And only 44 of those girls or people in prostitution had social insurance that year. And so that just proves that even though the thought behind the structure probably was good, it just did not work. The industry is inherently violent, and the girls, they have to abuse drugs and alcohol to be able to sustain and stay alive in that industry. And so they're not in a place where they can go and fill out papers and apply for a job. Another thing that I thought was significant was that girls and women that came to Sweden, that the police and social workers met with, that had been in Germany before, they said that clients were much more violent in Germany. And I wondered why, and they said, it's logic. If you come as a client with the right on your side, you're not doing anything wrong. You're just going to demand to get what you want. Whereas if you come already knowing that you're doing something illegal, you're buying someone for sex and it's not okay, then you're much more careful. And so they said that was another benefit of that they could see as well. The Netherlands, these statistics are actually the same for Germany as well, that 50 to 90% of the women in there, I think it's 60 to 90% in Germany, but a very high percentage of the girls, of the people in prostitution, are trafficked. And the reason for this is that the high demand has led to the industry growing so rapidly that organized crime just keeps supplying victims and people into the industry. Organized crime has kept control over the legal sector as well of the industry, and I have good sources for all of these things, so that you will be provided with that after this. The organized crime kept control, and hidden and the illegal prostitution grew. And this is the same in Australia. For example, I know in Victoria we have for every legal brothel there's 4 illegal ones. And the reason for this is that when we legalize, we create these structures where, you need to follow all these regulations. Well, a lot of the people won't be able to. They're underage, they're trafficked, they're not following the regulations, they're not covered by social insurance. And so then, because the demand is really high, the illegal sector grows and becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. And maybe you're asking, well, why are people talking about legalizing then when it's like that? Well, I think it's important to remember that there is a lot of money in the sex industry, and there are strong voices that want this industry to grow for whatever reason. And so, we need to be the louder voice, speaking about culture, speaking about what do we want to communicate to our kids? What do we want to communicate to the next generation? Another interesting thing that I think is that the former mayor of Amsterdam, Job Cohen, has said that this is no longer about small-scale entrepreneurs, but big crime organizations that are involved in trafficking women and drugs, killings, and other criminal activities. And so in 2014, the Council of Europe did an in-depth inquiry where they looked at the effects of legalizing prostitution versus the Nordic approach, or the human rights approach to prostitution. And they stated that legalization has proved ineffective, unable to either protect the victims involved or to break the ties between prostitution and organized crime. And then we have this quote as well from the police in Queensland. They have said, because their prostitution and brothels are legal, and the Crime and Misconduct Commission there has stated that sex trafficking appears to be one of the unfortunate consequences of an industry driven by excessive demand. And so that's just the same thing, that we have to look at the demand side of things. If we can make the demand go down, then we can stop the industry from growing. And so that's why these laws are so successful. And so just like a little recap there for you, that the Nordic approach, or the human rights approach to prostitution, reduced the demand for sexual services in the country. And today it's led to a big change in culture in Sweden. And people think differently about human trafficking and prostitution. They see that link. And I think that's because of the language that's being used. And I know that Rebecca is very strong on language. What language are we using? How are we building a culture with our words, with what we're communicating? And myself, I'm a mom of 3 little girls, and so it's really, really important for me with a culture that respects women and girls. I want them to grow up and have opportunities, and not have to be afraid, and not have to feel like they're objects, so that they're treated differently because they're women. And so this is really personally important to me. But I also really care about the people that are caught up in this industry, and I realize that this can happen to anyone. And one thing that Simon often says is there's so much pressure on the young generation today. They have to look good, they have to have the right clothes, they have to have enough likes on Facebook, and they have to have so many things. And so there's a lot of pressure, and this often leads to young people having a lot of anxiety, having a lot of mental health problems. And that is also why it's so dangerous if the sex industry is really good, really big and really strong. It's just an easy thing to fall into. I know, for instance, here in Australia that at some universities where the sex industry is legalized, they will have representatives for the sex industry at universities talking to the students and saying, hey, you know what, this is a great option for you when you're studying. You can make $1,000 over a weekend, you know, not anything really dangerous. You just come and you do your thing, and then you can go and you can have that money. And it sounds so easy, but we know that the statistics are showing us that it's not like that. You step into that industry and you are at great risk. And so we want to create, and I really, you know, I'm emphasizing that. I know that all of you believe in this as well, but I love to have that. I'm looking forward to the discussion and the conversation that we will have as well. But I think that the laws, they make a clear statement about respect for women and girls. And that's really important as well. And so now the Council of Europe has, after this extensive, after this inquiry and after this, they've recommended all its member states now through a resolution to adopt a successful human rights approach to prostitution. And so I'm believing that, you know, we're at the verge of something great. And I think a lot of countries are going to follow. I'm certainly working very hard to see Australia follow in this. I really believe that it's possible. And I'm working a lot with just seeing politicians, meeting with MPs and talking about this. And I find that they often see the links and understand and actually think that this is important. And so I'm really hoping that we'll have success in this in the years to come. But I think education is going to be so key, and the communication that we are having around this. But yeah, it obviously helps. I wanted to say something as well there about the Council of Europe. That is a very solid source, and they have done extensive research before they came to this conclusion. It's been said sometimes by organizations that want to legalize prostitution that the UN and the World Health Organization are promoting legalizing prostitution. But the thing is that their inquiries have not been based on, has not looked on this human rights approach. They looked at the older system where they criminalized the women for selling sex, and they compared that to legalizing, and they found that legalizing was better. But both of those systems are faulty because the first one does not respect women, and the demand is not going to go down. And the second one where you legalize, we've already talked about. And so that's why we have to be a little bit savvy and understand that, well, you probably haven't even looked into this yet. Then if you're saying that, if you have those, come to those conclusions, let's look at other options that are better and that build respect. Awesome. And so, you know, let's remember that human trafficking is not just something that happens over borders. This year's Trafficking in Persons report just brought up the fact that 70% of trafficking actually happens within our borders. And obviously, like I've said as well, we have close links between domestic violence and abuse in childhood with human trafficking, and then entering into the sex industry. And so I just want us to remember, you know, this is, it could be it could be the people in our world. And we have to remember that sometimes it is. I actually had this conversation with a friend of mine the other day, and she just shared with me that her mother had been in the sex industry and that she had committed suicide quite young. And I mean, that really touched me because I just was reminded again of, you know, she's now a victim of her mother's pain and her mother's experiences from the sex industry, and from the fact that that was just an open door for her when she was going through a hard time in her life. And I really just think we need to think of other ways. We need to think of other structures and other help systems to help people that struggle, and not just provide them with a ticket into the sex industry. And so, yes, that's what I wanted to say. Thank you so much for your attention.
Well, thank you so much, Lisa. I would like to open up for questions. I first wanted to thank you.
Right, I'm unmuted. You know, first of all, thank you, Lisa. That was amazing, just listening to the journey, really, of the links between the family domestic violence and those experiencing sex trafficking. One of the as I was thinking of questions, you kept answering everything as you talked along. I was interested. I was thinking, you know, once you legalised the actual prostitution in Sweden, but criminalised the buying of it, immediately I was thinking, well, I wondered if that pushed out into the countries that bordered Sweden. You know, did the sex industry just push across the borders? So that was the first question. And then is there an education, like, it just amazes me that there's even a demand for it, but is there also an education process alive and well in Sweden to reduce the demand?
Yeah, no, very much so. And I think it's the first step to bring in this legislation, because it just kind of it opens up the door for the communication to be very honest about what actually is happening. I think very often in countries where we legalize prostitution, there's this taboo to actually talk about the sex industry and what happens there. So I just recently had a conversation with a lady from the sex party here in Australia who wants to completely decriminalize prostitution. And I was asking her these questions as well. But I can tell that, you know, the sex industry, they do not want to have the conversation about respect for women, violence in the sex industry. They want to portray the message that none of that is happening, and that it's a woman's right to sell her body, and that it's a glamorous job that you can do and then leave. But my experience is that, I mean, even here in Australia, and I know it's different ways that this is expressing itself, but we have the massage parlors, and I'm sure you've seen them. You know, I was in the city last night with my husband, and then we just passed 5 massage parlors just on the way to our car, and they're blinking at 10:30 at night, open, and that is a sign of human trafficking. Because we know that the girls in there are not probably going to speak English, but they're also not going to tell you that they're trafficked when you go and ask them. And another example of that is when I was in Sydney a few years ago. That's kind of like the time when I really decided to devote myself to this. And I was there, and I know that market is legalized. And so I had heard all these things, but I hadn't seen them. And then I came to it was 8 George Street, so just 5 minutes walk from Darling Harbour. And I opened the window of our hotel room that we had booked, and the window across from ours was a brothel. And I realized as I looked down the street that every single house had one of these similar brothels. Like, it didn't say brothel, it said massage parlor, it said Thai girls, or there was some blinking lips at somewhere. But I realized first that we had booked a motel in the red light district by accident. But I also saw, you know, with my own eyes what happens. And then in the last night when we walked home, we had a really traumatic, kind of shocking experience where we were 4 or 5, I think we're 5 girls walking home from a conference. And there was this very young girl standing there. And I didn't even realize, because we were laughing and talking, so I didn't even realize that we had stepped into this area. And I looked at her and our eyes met. And she looked so uncomfortable and just ashamed and not, I don't know, it just got me to realize what was happening. And then I looked at her, and she was holding a sign in her hand, and it said $20. So 20 Australian dollars. And so this girl was standing outside one of these blinking massage parlor signs, selling herself for $20. And all of us saw her, and there was lots of girls that we walked past, but she just stood out. I think it was obvious that she did not want to be there. She was also very young. And so we didn't know what to do. And I've heard stories, and I know that these girls are at risk, and I know that they're very scared to talk, and I didn't want to put her at risk, but I also couldn't just walk away. So we just kind of decided to run into our hotel room and grab a book and just pretend like we were handing out things. We just wrote some phone numbers and an email address and things in that book, and we ran back, and it was just 5 minutes later. It was late night in Sydney, it was pouring down rain, and she was already gone when we got back. So just 5 minutes, and we were so upset that she wasn't there anymore. And then we decided to actually walk into the brothel just to see if we could see her, and which I'm not recommending anyone to do that. But we were 5 of us, so we were kind of feeling safe. And so we walked in, and none of the girls that we saw in there, they were all Asian girls. None of them spoke enough English to even understand what we were trying to say, that we wanted to give them a book. And so that for me is a giveaway for human trafficking. And that's one aspect of the sex industry that is going on. And those girls, they have no voice. They're in a country where they cannot speak the language. They know that they probably cannot trust the police, because they don't know who's the police and who's a pimp and who's testing them. And they know that they're very, very exposed to violence and, in danger in that sense. And so for me, I didn't sleep much those nights. I knew what was going on in the walls around, and it was really, really bothering me. And so that was the main reason for me to just say, no, actually, I'm going to just devote my time to this. But, I've also, since I've thought about it and worked with this, the domestic violence and the respect for women aspect of this, the culture that it communicates is becoming increasingly important to me as well. Because I think that, we do need to communicate a culture that values every human being, and that builds a culture of non-violence, where if we build and put in legal structures that we know are going to, that are going to cause violence, we just cannot justify that. Even, and I'm going to answer your question there as well. You asked if it pushes it outside of Sweden. And in a sense, while organized crime has, there's police evidence that organized crime does not think Sweden is a very lucrative market anymore. And so they have moved out, because it's very hard to make business when you can't have any brothels and can't bring in trafficked people. And yes, it's much easier to make money and do business in the Netherlands and in Germany. And so in that sense, it does. But I don't think that's a reason not to bring the laws in. I just think that needs to communicate, because I know that there's work being done in Germany and the Netherlands now as well. But once we have legalized it, the industry grows really strong, the voices grows really strong, and then it's very, very hard to bring change. I don't know if I answered your questions.
Thank you. Thank you.
No, you did. And it amazes me that, given the success of Sweden, that it's just not automatically picked up.
This is what most politicians say, actually, that I speak to. They're like, how is the sex industry, how have they been so successful in their communication about this? And this legislation actually came from feminists from the start, who said that, well, you know what, and that's surprising, because, I think many people like to put it in a moral box of like moral issues, but it's not one of those things. It's actually it's building a culture that respects everyone. And so they were saying, no, it's not a woman's rights issue to sell her body. It's actually vulnerable women being exploited by rich men. That's the reality of it. And so we're going to change the way we communicate. So I actually really think education is key. The more people we can have this conversation with, the more people will get it.
Say, I love your passion, Lisa, and I, don't ever give up. And I think it is absolutely amazing. And the world need more women like you. But can I hand over to Dave?
Yeah,
I really think having a man stand up as he has done in Rotary for so many years, and bring this very, very controversial, as it was back then, to the world, and showing so much respect for everyone when he's doing it. He does it with such respect and such a gentleman. So Dave, I would love for you to share what's happening in the action group.
Well, thanks, Rebecca, for having me. And Lisa, great presentation. You kind of hit everything. And thanks for all the work you're doing. And I think you may remember, but we hosted a summit with President Carter, and the entire approach was on the Nordic Approach. So and Simon was actually there and presented the approach that we had there. One question I had for you, and before I kind of go into the action group, was the one thing that came up with the Nordic Approach is the way we do it in the U.S. is we call it safe harbor law. So it decriminalizes prostitution for obviously minor children. We've actually began to address adult women too, so that men can be arrested after they call it pandering in the U.S. for twice for minor prostitution. So that's a huge step forward.
Yeah.
But the one thing that came up during the Carter Summit was in the Nordic Approach is that sometimes the criminalization for the buyers of these women or girls were not enforced as much as they thought they may be enforced.
Yeah, it's so true. And it's been one of the things that Simon has been criticizing quite a bit. He's been a little bit upset about that. From what I've understood, the reason for not making the laws very strong, with very strong teeth, if I can use that language, from the start, was that the main idea was to send a message. And I don't think they would have got it through if the point would have been to go for the men and shame the men and put the spotlight on the buyers, because it's a very sensitive topic. We never know who is actually a buyer, and there's quite a few that are. And so in order to, I think it was a very strategic move in that sense, and to be able to bring these laws in, to say, no, it's not really so much about shaming the men as it is about sending a message about culture and about respect for women and children and work against violence. And then over the years, people's perspective has changed. So now over 96% of the young population in Sweden support this legislation. And just recently, we've had some interesting events. So about 4 weeks ago or so, a very famous TV profile in Sweden was caught buying sex, and it was in a trafficking situation. He wasn't aware of that, but because somehow that made its way into the media. And the conversation that came up after that was great. It was all 100% about human trafficking. It was never about women's right to sell their bodies. The women that they had sex with were Romanian women that then later the police found that they had been trafficked into Sweden. And so after that, 5 out of the 7 big parties in Sweden have said that they actually going to make the laws stricter. And so now, later on, when these laws have been enforced and been available in Sweden long enough, it's not a problem. Everyone's agreeing. And so it's easy now to change. Whereas I don't know if they could have done that straight away. Although France is an example of one legislation where they have got much stricter rules, and they've got that through. But I believe that the lobbying was all the way up to the president there, and he was very key in actually bringing that legislation to pass. But they have that if you get caught, it does get put on your criminal records. And if you get caught a second time, you have to attend classes to see the links to domestic violence and human trafficking. And so you get training as a perpetrator so you understand what you're doing. Yeah.
Well, good. I know in the States, or at least in Georgia where I live, they in 2011, it was a $50 fine and misdemeanor for a pimp selling a child. And now they can get up to life in prison. And we've passed a safe harbor law a couple of years ago to decriminalize it for obviously children that are under the age of 18. Unfortunately, they were being prosecuted for something they couldn't control. But yeah, I appreciate all the work you're doing. And just a little background on the action group. And me, I learned about this issue in 2012 at a conference called the Passion Conference, which is where End It Movement was founded.
Oh, yeah.
And met a girl through the conference named Melissa, had her come speak to my Rotary Club when I was president. And she told her story about being trafficked in downtown Atlanta for several years. It's unbelievable. You could hear a pin drop in the room. And after the meeting, one of our members gave Melissa a big hug. I said, "How did you know Melissa?" He said, "She used to babysit my kids when she was 12. And so then it wasn't somebody else's problem, it was our problem. And so Rotary, as you probably know, is on the verge of eradicating polio, and we just do amazing stuff all over the world, and we're in over 200 countries. So what an opportunity for us to take this issue on. So I joined the action group in 2013, became chair of it this year, and we are now in 62 countries. And so we just see some real momentum. We actually have just elected new board members. One of them is what we call Rotaract, a young adult. So we've got some really exciting people coming on board. And guy named Matt Friedman. I don't know if you know him, but he's been a freedom fighter for many years, and he is now on our board of directors. And so we see some real positive aspects. And the other thing, kind of Rebecca's point, is when you first start talking about this issue, I would speak in South Georgia to a Rotary Club of men over 70, and they were like, what are you talking about? And I would start talking about their grandkids. And I said, this could be your grandkid. And then all of a sudden they perked up and wanted to engage, because this is the one issue that found domestic violence and human trafficking is the one issue that's in every community in the world. And during this COVID-19, we've seen a dramatic increase on trafficking, found domestic violence, because people are cooped up, they're angry, they're not able to get out. And so we're seeing a dramatic increase. And also because of now with school systems and online learning, the kids are online all the time with very little supervision. So you've got the predators reaching out to them. So we see we have a long way to go, but we see some real positive steps. I know that I joined the White House Task Force on Human Trafficking about a year ago, and they've invested, I think it was $48 million on the issue, which is terrific. It's the first time we've got that kind of money out of the administration, so we're excited about that. And we just are really excited to see what the next steps hold, and love to continue the conversation with you, Lisa, and how we can work together on the issue. We now have coordinators in every continent in the world. We just picked up, there's a lady that I met virtually. That's the one, I guess, advantage about this. You're meeting more people virtually than you would have without this. So she's from Kenya, and she runs Missing Kids Kenya. Wow. And it's an amazing program. She works quite closely with National Center for Missing Exploited Children. And so she's now one of our coordinators. We picked up another one in Hawaii that we were going to do a lot of work with at the convention. And she, obviously that didn't happen, but she became a coordinator for us. So we've really seen the growth in the action group and people wanting to engage. I think too, and I'll close, is that, people don't think, a lot of people you talk to do not think it happens in their neighborhood or around them. And once they hear the story, they say, how can I help? And we offer, I always say Rotary offers hope. And so that's what we try to do is give that message of that one person, and Rotary, and we kind of use the phrase, the power of one. So you do for one what you wish you could do for all. And I think we do it in Rotary, community by community, and we can make a huge impact.
Yeah, that's so true. And it's important, I guess, to remember that, because it can feel like such a big and impossible problem and task sometimes. But I do find you just keep taking the next step, and then you just talk to this one and that one and this one, and then suddenly you are making a difference. But it's one step at a time, really.
Yeah, that's right. One foot in front. And like somebody said early on when I was getting engaged in this, he said it's a marathon, not a sprint.
Yeah, that's right.
If you think about that, you just continue to never give up. And when you feel like you want to give up, there's that one story that pops up.
That's it.
You can't give up. Yeah.
Before you go, Rebecca, can I just say it's such a pleasure to be involved and to be in the company of people that are passionate, that are working for the good of our society, and that reflect Rotary and why we are Rotarians, and the job that Rotary is able to do in the community, which is about facilitating various community government groups to come together to work for the better of our society.
Yes.
So it's a privilege to be involved, and a privilege to think at the end of the day that in some small way you can have a positive impact on somebody's life. Is that's an amazing thing.
Absolutely.
No, it is.
So
and congratulations, your club, President Gordon, your club got voted. Was it the most influential club of the decade or something?
Yeah, we voted Club of the Decade yesterday, as a matter of fact. And
congratulations.
Congratulations, that's amazing.
Yeah, so we were, Gordon, our current president, is a technology guy. So imagine the fortune we had during this time that we had a technology guy as president. So he led us through the challenging times. And he actually has been my kind of Facebook and technology person since I started this. So yeah, so it was exciting. Thank you. We had